Well, let's make a start. Welcome everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there today, Liz, but I had the pleasure of being one of Liz's supervisors, and she's got an absolutely fascinating topic. So a little bit different to what we normally often do at IFI. So if you're expecting a hardcore stats presentation, you can leave now. But if you want to see a fascinating topic, this is such a great topic, and as I told Liz, there was a winner from the beginning of this topic, and she's done a marvellous job, so I'd like to introduce to you now Liz, Dr. Liz Davies. Nearly doctor.
Thank you, Anthony. Yes. So yes, my topic is identifying and responding to the psychosocial support needs of young people when a loved one is missing. And I just realised John hasn't given me the clues on this, but we'll see how we go. Yep, all right. So I submitted on the 29th of June this year, and the PhD was marked in 16 days, which I think was either they thought I was going to die because of my age, or it was so fascinating or simply written, but they marked it in 16 days. So I was quite surprised. I described myself at my confirmation of candidature back in 2015 as a practitioner researcher. And really I'm a practitioner who has done some research, and I continue to be a practitioner. Where it all began, in 2000, so I'm an accredited mental health social worker is what my title is. I have an undergraduate degree in social work and some other small teaching and training qualifications. In 2010 I went to work for the Department of Justice, Families and Friends of Missing Persons Unit, which I didn't realise was the only unit of its kind in the country, funded by government, and the only unit in the world that was funded by government to support the families of missing people, to support those left behind. So I turned up, and we referred to it as FFMPU. I turned up as the manager of team leader of a team of social workers and psychologists who worked with those left behind, mainly in New South Wales. But what became evident was, because we were fairly well placed and the only unit, we had international links, interstate and international links. So from 2012 to 2013 I went into work one day and I said to the team, people started asking us about young people and what happened for young people when a loved one was missing, and I went into the team and I said, we're going to run a group for young people, and it was the first and only group that's ever been run in the world. There was another group in the States that was a support group for siblings of abducted children, but this particular support group was the only one in the world, and everybody really wanted a piece of it when we were very mindful about the need for privacy and safety and confidentiality for the young people. In 2013 I was approached by two academics / mental health professionals in the UK wanting access to the young people we had engaged with. And I presented a couple of times in the UK, and the fact that they have, I think, a land mass about a fifth the size of Australia and a population 3 times the size of Australia, and yet they weren't engaging. It didn't seem that young people were engaging with the particular service that was not our equivalent but was the closest thing in the UK to what FFMPU was within Australia. So they started asking to access what we were doing, and at that point I thought, why am I giving this away? And that was where the beginnings of this came from. I wrote that there is vision present, and I just realised, I'll come back in a minute, that there was vision present in the funding of FFMPU, Families and Friends, and it was the Attorney General, Bob Davies, who provided the first funding back in 2000 as a result of the disappearance of two high-profile missing persons cases around 1998 and 2000. There was also, in those days, really solid support for the team and for me to do research. That support later, I think, whether you call it economic rationalism, whatever you call it, that support was no longer there. I stopped working for FFMPU in 2018. Now, what I haven't done, and it's a bit late now and probably disrespectful, is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and Aboriginal elders past and present. And I was going to say in the Aboriginal people here today, but I'm not aware of whether there are any, and certainly Anthony's listening, I hope. I also want to really thank Janet.
Yes.
Thank you, Anthony, and I'm sorry that the order is already messed up. I also want to thank Janet, Anthony and Fabry, who really were amazingly good, present and supportive, unfailingly supportive supervisors. So the support I had within Justice, while not necessarily lasting, and a couple of other PhDs have come out of the same unit I worked in, the support was certainly very much from my three supervisors. I will get into this in a minute. In 2015, my life changed quite dramatically. My candidature was confirmed in June, and my two adult sons referred to 2015 as the year I lost my marbles. Partly because I was doing this research and for some other issues that were occurring at the same time. But interestingly enough, this hangs on my wall, and I only bought it this year. And their joke is that 2020 is the year I found my marbles again, and I didn't go and buy this because I found my marbles, I bought it beforehand. So it's been a really very interesting, challenging 5 years, and now I'm here. I'm going to talk a bit about what I did and how I did it and what I found. And I will use a lot of the quotes, because the quotes from the young people, from the parents, and some from service providers are incredibly meaningful and profound quotes. And this is a parent and the first two lines. And this parent is part of a police training video. We worked alongside police often, but we had nothing to do with the investigation. So no amount of life experience can prepare a person for something like this. And as somebody who had worked in health and then in justice for 30 years, and worked with people who'd experienced trauma and loss, I'd come across in that time probably a couple of missing persons cases. We didn't hear about them. Nobody talked about them. People were referred for depression or anxiety, and we might occasionally hear that somebody had gone missing in their lives. But there was never that connection particularly made, and we certainly never saw young people. So this PhD is not a study of traditional grief and loss. It does not subscribe to the more traditional stage models. And I know when I did my final year review, when we talk about traditional stage models, who do people think of? It's not a Kubler-Ross. You've heard of Kubler-Ross? Yeah. So this, people talk about the stages of grief. When somebody is missing for 40 years, how do you ever progress through those stages of grief? So it doesn't subscribe to that traditional way of looking at grief. The research started from a position of understanding that grief and loss are associated with more than clear, mostly death-related losses. So there are lots of other losses that we encounter in life that don't necessarily occur as a result of somebody dying. And I don't want to stand here and compare and contrast, but I just want to say that there's a far greater range of losses that we never actually think about at times. It describes lived experience of not knowing, and this came up over and over again. How do you live with not knowing? How do you live with uncertainty? Not knowing what has become of a loved one. Where there is a lack of resolution and ongoing uncertainty, there is anxiety, and that happens for people who work in the area as well. If we're very solution-focused people and we're into finding answers, working with the families of missing people doesn't give you answers. It's about how do I sit, how do I manage the ambiguity that occurs within the situation. Those left behind do not forget or move on. And everybody talks about moving on and closing the door and finding closure. That doesn't happen. People certainly look for meaning and they look for comfort and some form of, I hesitate to even say resolution, because Boss, the principal theorist, Pauline Boss, would say it defies resolution. Aspects of the experience of missingness cannot be measured. They are not quantifiable. You know, how do you measure the degree of discomfort or, how do you quantify the experience of those who are left behind? So, the aims of the research, it was about a voice for young people, to develop and promote an understanding of the experience of young people when a loved one is a missing person, to describe the role of parents responding to young people in this situation, and to identify and inform best practice for service providers responding to young people and those who support them when someone is missing. And I talk about missing, and when I presented my final year review, people said we don't like, I used missing in terms of a noun, a verb, an adjective, a state of being. I started to talk more about missingness, which is what other researchers have used because it clarified it a bit more. But we also just talk about those who are left behind. I used a phenomenological approach. I was studying the phenomenon of missingness. There were 3 studies. Studies 1 and 2, I used semi-structured interviews, and 1 and 2 on the side. There were 10 young people and there were 8 parents of young people. Not all of the parents had a young child who was involved in the research, and did all of the young people had a parent who participated, if that makes sense. There were 28 service providers who responded to an online, it was a Qualtrics survey. The missing people, there were 9 missing people related to the 18 young people and parents who were aged between 15 and 61 years at the time they went missing. And they were missing at the time of the interviews in 2015-16, they had been missing between 2.5 and 43 years. The intentionally blurry photo on the right is 4 of the young people who first attended in the loop, and they were very happy. They also participated in the research. They were very happy. There's a much clearer photo of them in a book they helped us make, they helped us produce, which was then taken to, it was internationally published and translated as well, because we found out afterwards that it was the only book of its kind. So it was called In the Loop. They came up with the name because that was where they wanted to be. They wanted to be kept in the loop. Just a few quotes. It is more than anything a traumatic experience of loss. You know, loss and trauma go hand in hand. This is Tara, whose brother had been missing at the time of the interview about 43 years and is still missing. and she was at school in Sydney at the age of 13 when she was informed that her brother was a missing person. And she talks about her family. It was shattered, it was totally obliterated, life as we'd known it. All the pieces fragmented and they never fitted together properly again. And that cloak of sadness just sat over everything. We tiptoed around trying not to cause any grief. I guess we didn't know what to do. Feeling powerless to put the pieces back together and powerless to help Mum get over the grief, to help Mum practically and physically. Powerlessness, as you probably know from the DSM, is one of the two requirements for a diagnosis of PTSD. Now, I'm not saying these people had PTSD, but they certainly had a trauma response, a sense of powerlessness, a sense of helplessness to make any difference in what was going on. Okay, I did have notes to go with all of this, but I'm not using the notes because they're there. What did young people want? They told us really clearly that they wanted honest, factual, I added careful only this morning, carefully presented information, because there was obviously information they could not, sometimes information needed to be censored a little. The media is fantastic at presenting lots of information, some of which was really awful. And parents were mindful of that. But more than anything, they wanted the truth. They wanted to be told what was going on, because they would pick up on what was going on. Every one of them I interviewed knew there was something wrong before they were told, or they were already vigilant about what was happening. Young people wanted recognition of the trauma they were experiencing. It wasn't the children are seen and not heard, or let them just go off and be young people. They wanted to be young people, but they also wanted to be involved in what was happening. And I think for young people, one of the things that, the factors that, or the impacts that was evident was that yes, they were affected, but they also wanted to carry on with their lives, and they didn't want one to be seen as dismissing or impacting the other. They were able to do both. Having a missing loved one resulted in an irrevocable change, but as I said, they still wanted to be young people. They wanted to be allowed to not know, and what I mean is they didn't have to find an answer. They didn't have to accept what sometimes the adults around them accepted, and that was, one of the young people talked about, my mother came and said to me, "That's it, he's dead." And she said, "Well, how do I know that?" Because for all of the 10, eventually during the research 2 missing people were located, but they were located deceased. So for the other 8, their loved one remains missing. They have no factual evidence to prove that their loved one, they don't have, and it sounds really blunt, they don't have a body. They don't know. So being allowed to live with not knowing, that idea of hold a candle, it wasn't unrealistic. It was just, it was easier to hold a dialectical way of thinking, maybe gone, maybe not, than to try to sit on one or another end of a continuum about, well, he definitely is dead, because then the media would report somebody being found 15 years after they'd gone missing, and the family members would say, and the young people would say, that could be my person. There was always that possibility. They wanted purposeful inclusion. They wanted to be included in what was going on. They wanted to practice and to be involved in meaningful rituals. For some, the one whose 2 quotes I used about the family being obliterated talked about, she wrote an article for the Good Weekend, and it was, they found meaning by writing, by singing, by connecting with others. That was the inclusion as well. Emotional connection with people who get it, and they were pretty good at picking up who got it and who didn't, who wanted to pigeonhole them and who was having to sit with them in this space of not knowing. They wanted to do it in their own time, and so for some of them it was, when I talked about 2.5 and 43 years, one was found after 2.5 years and the other one was found after 30 years. But they wanted to be able to not have anyone else telling them how best to live with not knowing. But timely support and telling who they wanted to tell was important. So this is what sort of support was available to young people? Well, the first thing I put was that it was absent. I asked my mother why she never supported me, and this Margot, and they're all pseudonyms, Margot was 13 when her father went missing. My mother said, it never occurred to me that you needed support. And you have to think, what part of looking after a 13-year-old would suggest that they didn't need support? But I met Margot for the first time when Margot was just over 40. And that was the first time she'd met people who talked to her about ambiguous loss. The support was sometimes accidental and it came from unexpected places. This is Tara, who talked about my family was obliterated. And there were different levels of eloquence, if you like, but Margot and Tara were particularly eloquent in the way they expressed their experience. Her parents were busy searching, as often happened, and that was something, parents became physically absent in the search for the missing person. At times psychologically absent, they were so preoccupied. But Tara discovered that her grandmother was there for Tara and for her 2 siblings. She was an absolutely wonderful woman. She communicated everything. I think she was trying to keep us informed. She gave us information when our parents couldn't. So there was then informal and formal support, and it was limited, and it remains limited. And certainly the support that was withdrawn from the unit I managed means that the support group for young people no longer continues, and COVID has made a difference to the other support groups that are available. So informal were friends, family members, other young people. One young person talked about going to the park with his friend and just sitting talking. And when I said, so what did your friend talk to you about? And he said to me, he didn't, he just listened to what I was saying. And it's about not having to have answers, just being prepared to listen. For this particular one, Eliza, who was studying, by the time I met her, she was a social worker, but she was at uni. She was the oldest in that group of young people. She was in first year uni. Dad was the main one. He kept me posted. My impression was that initially there was nothing we could really do. Once again, that sense of hopelessness. I didn't drop out of uni to come and be with them during this time, but I'm pretty sure I was calling them every day. Then there was more formal support that came from mental health providers. I didn't need to be like fixed or whatever. It was more just, I guess, it aided with talking and getting through the situation. Being able to talk to somebody that was removed from the situation. I could just tell them what I was thinking and we just chatted. No opinionated responses. And if somebody offered one, they'd soon let you know. That being able to sit with not knowing was important. I met one person, and I think I spoke about this before, who was having a lot of difficulty. People often talk about I'm not coping. And I say to them, well, what does coping look like? Because coping is sometimes not sitting in a corner rocking. coping is being on your feet. And this particular one, I would check in with her and do some grounding, and I would say to her, well, what have you done today? And she said, I've had a coffee and 10 cigarettes. And I'd say, it's okay. What about something to eat? But she went to the GP and she said, I'm not coping. And the GP said, well, I guess you're just going to have to learn to cope. And we worked very much from a position of reassuring people that what they were doing, unless they were really hurting themselves, was okay. That it was an individual decision, and that was the same for young people. Purposeful inclusion, it started with young people, connecting with others who get it. The young people talked about the missing persons events they'd been allowed to be a part of, support group meetings they attended and their parents attended. Social media, it was more an adult thing, and I think Facebook is, increasingly an old person thing, but they followed what was happening on Facebook rather than posting anything, but they would follow and sometimes like. Their parents and other adult family members were far more involved in social media. They wanted access to information, but sometimes finding that information was difficult. We ended up producing a lot of it, like the book, because it was otherwise not available. As I was writing the final chapters this year, suddenly all the things I was suggesting were affected by COVID. Suddenly the physical meetings that we had done for the last, we'd facilitated for the last 5-10 years weren't available. So there was a need for more online information and online training for service providers and those left behind. Again, I've said access to information. Psychoeducation for people. People don't understand what happens when somebody goes missing. And young people were told things like, oh, he's just missing. Worse things have happened to me. Well, it was about educating around trauma and the impact of someone going missing. Young people, parents, mental health professionals. If you have a really solution-focused approach to practice, then it doesn't work well with something that is as ambiguous as this is. Teaching staff, they were all in contact with, they were all having daily contact with teachers, although many teachers weren't aware of what was going on, and investigators, and I'm talking about police, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. People who don't understand the nature of ambiguity may fail to offer support or comfort for those left behind. That idea of just move on, just get over it. Parents need to be able to admit they don't know, and often that's difficult. It's like, what will I say? It's okay to say, I don't know. I can't answer that question. Nobody can. We're trying to find some answers, but nobody can answer those questions. The amount of support young people receive is dependent on their parents' emotional availability. And again, that Tara talking about my grandmother was available because my parents couldn't be. It was about having an adult who was emotionally available. Somebody, and whenever I do anything these days that's around a critical incident or a crisis event, it's about who's in your corner. And there has to be somebody in the young person's corner. There has to be, for us as adults, somebody in our corner. The way parents cope and the support parents receive impacts their ability to support young people. And that's particularly so from police. And again, I'll come back to that because police are often the first, usually the first and sometimes the only official point of contact. If they weren't referred on, if families weren't referred on to support services, because police often didn't know about them, or sometimes didn't know about them, then it was just the police they dealt with. And the police are primarily investigators. They're not into working with ambiguous loss and hanging in there for what can be years. Psychologically present or emotionally available adults are more likely to be able to support their young person. This is Eliza, who was at uni. Dad was frustrated with the lack of support, and in fact he then became involved at an interagency level as the parent representative with FFMPU. Because when Eliza's brother went missing, FFMPU was very new. We're talking now 17 years ago. 17 years he's been missing. Dad was frustrated with the lack of support, and I guess I never really believed the police, were doing much. Then he met a constable he felt would really listen and seriously hear him. And we do talk about people being experts in their own experience, knowing the most about the missing person, being asked what they knew. One of the young people, if she'd been asked, would have suggested where to look for the loved one who was later found, because she had been there with her loved one. I was just glad Dad was feeling listened to, because I felt like he was hitting his head up against a brick wall, and that was just exacerbating the turmoil he was in. I haven't understood my whole life what you do when you don't know. I read Ambiguous Loss by Pauline Boss. And Pauline Boss is an 85-year-old psychology professor in Minnesota, who I first heard speak in 2011. And the first book she wrote is a little paperback called Ambiguous Loss. And she started writing in the 70s about her own experience of migration and her parents' experience, and then later she wrote about the Vietnam War and the losses, both ambiguous and disenfranchised, that people returning experienced. It's topical when you think about what's currently in the media around Afghanistan. What happens when somebody's experience is disenfranchised or lumped into one particular experience. And I'm talking about Afghanistan at the moment. This is what everybody did. No, this is what some people did. Recognising that people's experiences are different is really important. Read Ambiguous Loss. It was excellent because of the simple thing that you don't have to know. And I guess what she doesn't say is for sure. The approach of service providers to family, no matter our age, life experience or level of educational training, we need to be receptive to a view that is different to the traditionally held understandings of grief and loss. Approaching any loss, including ambiguous loss, from a strengths-based rather than a solution-focused perspective is best practice. It allows you to sit with the person in their particular situation rather than look for a solution to the difficulties, because again, there were no solutions often. And the rest of these are just the approach of service providers. Certainly one of my recommendations was that we all need to have a better understanding of grief and loss, and not this rigid traditional view. We need to have an understanding of the nature and dynamics of ambiguous loss. And I'm not suggesting that people have to suddenly become therapists. They just have to know that all losses are not so clear. And closure, while a lovely cliche, is not always possible. A better understanding of mental health and mental illness. And that was particularly so for young people at school. And they all said to me, not all of them, but the majority said to me, I wish people at school had understood better. I wish I had understood better. One of them talked about listening to a presentation on mental health and schizophrenia and having the penny drop that that was probably a possible diagnosis for her missing brother, and leaving the lecture and going out and ringing her mother. And she said it made some sense for me when otherwise I couldn't make sense of what had happened. asking young people what they need. Very often they weren't asked. The police are best placed to ask about who is in the family and who to refer on to available support. You know, the idea that the police often came in contact with one family member and that person was the senior next of kin. And we might get a referral at FFMPU for that one person, and it would be then asking, well, who else is in the family? It almost normalises the idea that people might need support if they're asked, tell me what's happening for the others. I'm not saying that people have to be therapists, just that they have to, asking about who else is in the family implies, as Pauline Boss says, that this is something people very often need support to get through. I only wrote this morning, and yet it's through the thesis. Don't abandon families or judge their efforts to cope. They're doing the best they can. And the idea of families being abandoned was like, well, don't they get he's not coming back? Or don't they get she's dead? And families started to report, and young people felt they couldn't ask. They started to report that they felt like they were a nuisance. You know, I want to hear what's happening. And after a while, there was nothing happening because information dried up. But it was at that point that we were saying, then refer them on, put them in touch with others who have not the same but a similar, a shared experience. So we were saying to police that they needed to have an awareness of support and referral options. And I think, no, I'm not quite at the last. I talk about a trauma-informed approach, but that really applies to police in everything they do. Do people know what a trauma-informed approach is? An awareness that many people are affected by some form of trauma, and to be mindful of that rather than seeing a presentation as, well, what we have here is what we've got. The idea of anticipating or just being mindful that people bring more than what we initially see to any situation. Certainly for police in Scotland at the moment are training all their officers in this trauma-informed approach. Communication between agencies and service providers. It took time, but what people received was a rounded response rather than this siloed, fragmented response where agencies and service providers didn't talk to each other. It took time, but it was worth it. Interagency collaboration, because this is more than just an investigation. When the investigation has been exhausted, when the person hasn't been found, the family members weren't in a position to just go, well, that's it, we'll stop looking. They continued to look. They continued to report looking 30 years later and longer. And that's the end of my presentation.